I think our library team is going to start us off, and then I will pop in and talk a bit about museum stuff. So take it away, library.
Hi, Rachel, can you turn on my video, please? This is Mark. Well, I'll just go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Shelsted.
Mark, you should be able to turn on your own video on the bottom left. There you go.
There we go. Here I am. Thank you. Thank you. We're really happy to be here today to talk about how to help preserve your family photographs and papers. I'm going old school and talking about the original photographs and prints and photograph materials. If you're like me, I recently was given this literal shoebox of photos by my mom recently with all sorts of older pictures that I've got to figure out what to do something with right now, including one of, I think this is fourth grade, that's been faded and I have to do something with. So generally, the best thing you can do for your photograph and family papers, just diaries, letters, is to store them in a cool, dry place. We're really blessed here in Colorado to have some really quality RH that doesn't pose an issue and avoiding extreme temperature and humidity swings. We are recommending, you find a cool, dark place to store these things, avoid the attics, avoid the basements. These things tend to get wet. And to put them in storage containers that will prolong the life of these materials. And that includes taking them out of the frames and then putting them into something that would support them as well as help you be able to identify them, including something like these plastic sleeves that are available from some supply vendors such as Gaylord and Universal Products, where you can write on the sleeve itself the activity that had happened and the dates to further help you identify these things when you come later or when a family member is asked, well, what were you doing here? Well, this is my spring break trip from 1989. So that's what are in the photos. So help me remember this in the future as well. And then finally, to get some quality storage, like an archival storage box, that's pH neutral and in and of itself won't damage the materials. So generally, the short of it is to make sure that you're working on a clean surface. Wash your hands. You don't have to worry about the Mickey Mouse gloves. Wash your hands. If you have to write anything on the back of the photos, use a #2 pencil. That's the best thing we can do. And then use some quality supplies. And I'll pop some vendors in the chat if you'd like. I would, however, express caution at some of the crafts stores. They're getting better, but I would be very suspicious of what they sell or claim to sell as archival quality materials. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues from the libraries who will talk to you about the born digital content.
All right, so I think I'm up next. My name is Trista Barker. I'm a digital and archive specialist at Morgan Library, and I'm going to talk about digitizing your photos at home. So the first step is to get organized. Before you start scanning, you need to go through and organize all of your photographs. Make note and set aside any duplicate photos so you don't have to scan the same image twice. If there's something written on the back of the photo, make a note of what that says on your spreadsheet, or you can also scan the back of your photo so that information is together. It's good to sort your photos in chronological order. If you're not sure of the date, it's okay to guess by either who is in the photo, what they're wearing, surroundings, background, etc. Decide what you're going to scan. Choose a naming system that makes sense to you and will be easy to navigate later. If you also have photos from a digital camera, pick a file naming system that will distinguish between the two. And as you would do with your digital camera photographs, you also need to record the file names on your spreadsheet. So pick a way to store your files with whatever way you choose to store them, whether it's on your computer's hard drive, an external hard drive, or a cloud-based service. it's always a good idea to have a backup and store it on a separate entity, so just in case something happens. So now you're ready for scanning. Depending on how much storage space you do have for your photos, there are a few options on what to choose for your scanner settings. A lower PPI will make a smaller file size, but the image will also be smaller with less detail. So for preservation purposes, I'd say don't go lower than 300 PPI. That number is good for retaining detail in the photo, as well as if you want to make an actual print later. And then if you want to enlarge that image, 600 PPI is high enough for that. And if you want to save on file size, saving as a JPEG will suffice for preservation needs. If you plan on editing the photo at some point, you should save it as a TIFF file. TIFFs are larger, but they retain the digital information you would need for editing software. And then whether or not a photo is in color or black and white, you should be scanning at 24-bit color, and that will give you the best output for preservation. And then if needed later, you can always edit the photo to be in grayscale, but you can't add color to an already grayscale image. So that's why it's good to scan in color. And then usually scanning software will adjust, like make automatic adjustments for brightness, contrast, and exposure. So the scanner is trying to make it look the way it does in the original photograph. So if there's something, you can leave those settings alone if you're okay with that, but you can also use those settings to make adjustments. And then if you don't like how it's turning out, you can always set them back to default and start all over again. So, and then now you're ready to do a test scan on one of your photos. And it's always good to do that because you need to make sure your settings, your file names, and your file types are what you want them to be. And you always want to check that it's saving to the proper storage folder so you don't have to go looking around for it later. And then if everything looks good, you can keep scanning. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Trista. My name is Helen Bear. I'm head of the Digital Repositories Unit at the libraries, and I am also delighted to be here today talking with you. We had a question in the chat from Nancy a few minutes ago about tagging, so I'll address that next. You want to avoid using tagging as the only method of identifying people in your photographs. Because believe me, when you come back 20 years later and you're not quite sure who those people were, you're going to be very sad if you can't find a family member to help you out with that. The history of information technology is littered with software that has gone kaput, so I would be very careful about choosing a particular platform and using its metadata functions. There are many cases where you simply can't transfer over that information that you've spent all this time working on. A better method is to put that someplace else if you can. You can try to embed some information in file names, though. If you put too much in a file name, it gets really long and confusing. You can also do a spreadsheet, which will sort of help tie together your storage. You can put things in folders. You can say, these are my family photos from 1986, and that will be in the folder title. That would also help you quite a lot. So I hope that helps you, Nancy, with that. I have a few more comments before we move on to our museum colleagues. It's really, really great when you have dates also on your folders when you're titling things, because that's one of the two things that are so frustrating to come back to later, let's say 30, 40 years later. One, you don't know who the people are, and two, you don't know when the photo was taken. So if you can, if you know the date, by all means record it. Your family will thank you many, many times over. I wanted to talk about storage just for a moment. It's always a good idea to keep more than one backup. And storage media is improving so much these days. It's much less expensive than it used to be. This is a 16 gig thumb drive that I have in my office right now. It's really small and it holds many, many, many family photos. I even have a 1 terabyte drive right now in my office. This is just the size of my hand. A terabyte is a ton of photos. So if you can get yourself some stuff like this and try to keep it safe, you'll be better off. It's good to have a backup in another location away from your originals if possible. That way, if something happens to one, it's less likely that they'll both be hit at the same time. And I do want to remind you that hardware failure is real. Like, things just happen, and it may not be your fault. And those of us who have been in the archives world for a while have many stories of things just giving up the ghost and failing. So keep that in mind. I want to talk about file formats for just a second. And Trista did a great job of talking about when a JPEG is appropriate and when you might want to keep a TIFF, if, for instance, you're wanting to do editing on your photos. But if you're contemplating something like a spreadsheet or a Word document to help you organize yourself in your folders and keep track of what the content is, I'd recommend that you stay away as much as possible from proprietary formats, because those eventually will get so old they won't transfer or open very well. So when you have a choice about it, choose plain text over anything else. And when you have a choice, choose a CSV over an Excel file. That way you're more guaranteed to be able to access that really important data in the future. I have one more comment just about file naming for you guys. File names can get really long and ugly, or so short that you don't know what they mean at all. There's a spectrum here. So you have a spectrum of no meaning at all, and then you have the spectrum over here of way too much meaning. So what you want to do is find a happy medium for yourself, whatever that is that makes it work for you. And you also want to try to focus on information that you don't think will be changing. So if you know a date, but you're not so sure about a person, you might want to consider like naming something with the date. You also want to make sure your file names are not too long. There are certain systems that get upset with you when your file name is too long or has weird characters in it or something like that. And last of all, you want to find a system that works for you. You don't want to spend too much time just going nuts over file naming, but think about it like Trista was saying earlier. Think about your project, get organized, decide how you want to approach it, and then try it out. Do the test photos, set up some test folders, and then adjust it as you need to, and then you're ready to go. That's all from my part. On to you, Katie.
All right, some excellent tips here from the library team. I had a couple of slides to just kind of reiterate some of the main points from the handout that we sent. The library has some, in there too with some further details of the material that they went over today. But so as far as, and I'm focusing on textiles because that's what the Avenir Museum and me as myself also specializes in, but some of these things really, they cross over to other kinds of like three-dimensional objects that you might have from your family, like pieces of furniture or paintings or statues or things like that. Each kind of type of material is a little bit different, but for textiles, one of the most important things is to store them in a stable climate, so a place where you don't have a lot of temperature or humidity fluctuation. While photos really like the kind of drier air here in Colorado, textiles don't. So it's important to kind of think about that a little bit, but you also don't want to store them in a place that's super moist, because that can attract mold and mildew and other kinds of creepy crawly pests that can be bad for your fabric. But really the most important thing is like, don't put it out in your garage where the temperature is fluctuating a lot. Put it inside your home where you probably maintain a more steady temperature for your own personal comfort too. The other big thing with textiles is to keep it out of the direct light. And so a great place is to put it inside of a closet, and in particular, one that's not used a lot. If it's your personal closet that you are going in and out of every day to get your clothes, you're likely to bump or jostle your textile heirlooms and could cause some, damage inadvertently. And then the other thing is when you are kind of packing them away carefully to store, to use inert materials for padding them out when you're padding your folds and for covering them up from dust and light. So things like undyed muslin fabric or white cotton sheets. You want to try and get unbuffered acid-free tissue if you're looking for tissue to use. and then acid-free boxes. And so some of the materials that Mark was talking about and some of the companies he referenced as resources to purchase those materials where you can really know that you can trust that they are quality materials are included at the end of the handout where there are some resources with links to those places listed. And those would have things for storing your textiles, but also for storing your family letters and photographs. The only thing I'm going to say about digitally documenting your artifacts is, and this applies to any kind of digital documentation where I think Helen and Trista both were referencing this, is that you've got to choose your organization method and stick with that method. You might, if you readjust your method, if you figure out it's not really working for you, then you have to remember to go back and reapply that organizational method to all of your digital documentation so that it's consistent and you remember the switch. And so that applies to how you choose to number or name your files, in particular of like your image files, whether that be a scanned photograph or if you decide to take a photograph of an object to kind of document that object, you want to be consistent and to stick with it once you decide what you're doing. The last thing that I just wanted to say is to have fun while you're doing this. It can be a really fun thing to do with your family members. I know right now we're heading into a season that's going to be maybe a little bit less family around us immediately, but this is something you can do with each other over Zoom. Like Mark was just sharing his family photos, and it brings up a lot of fun stories and memories, and you can get everybody involved in this project to bring in the kids and have them listen to stories from grandma and grandpa that brings you together across the generations. So we're hoping that this might be something fun for everybody to do, in addition to helping you preserve these materials for generations to come. And then the final thing that I just want to mention before we open it up for the Q&A is that the library folks who are here and the museum folks who are here, we came together earlier this year as a new team to put together a virtual exhibition called Threads of Our Community, A History of the Avenir Museum. And we came together through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities CARES Act Cultural Organizations grant to bring you some archival materials that Trista and Helen helped us digitize, and Mark helped us put it all together into a wonderful online exhibition from the museum that we will put a link to the virtual exhibit site on the chat that you can go see how we digitize some things from the museum and the museum's story and history and some of the folks that helped us build it. And there were some other wonderful people who collaborated on that project with us from the museum and the library side who aren't here with us today. So a shout out to all of them as well. And please go check that out when you are not busy organizing your own family treasures. So I'll end there, and now we can open it up for questions, which I know Heather from the museum is going to help us moderate. I know we've gotten a lot of them coming in from the chat and the Q&A. So take it away, Heather.
Yeah, I have a few from the chat already, but please keep rolling your questions in. I'll keep monitoring the chat. If you could just document who you want your question directed to, typically I can figure it out, but so if not, no worries. We just excited to answer your questions. So I will start with a question for Mark from Anne. Any experience with archival methods products?
Yes, they are also a good vendor. I've listed just a couple of them, but there are other out there like archival products.
Awesome. Next is for Helen, or potentially anybody from the library. Are there any clever automated ways to put the creation date as if it were when the photo was taken into the scanned digital file, such that they automatically sort in chronological order in services like Google Photos?
Probably your camera is already recording a date. And if you can figure out in a Windows folder how to show that date and then sort by it in that column, it should work really, really well.
Wonderful. Hopefully that answers your question, Roland. Next, Helen again. Are there any clever automated ways to put the creation? Oh, did I just have that same one? I did. So sorry. For those of us at home without an official scanner, what do you recommend for scanning? From Jan.
I think I'll pass that one to Trista. She's better on equipment than I am.
Yeah, so I guess it would depend if you are planning on buying a scanner. I just have a regular HP 3-in-1 scanner. I think it's a fax machine too because it's old, but scanner, printer, copier, that works just fine. There's really, especially nowadays, any printer or any scanner from Office Max or Target, Walmart, that will just take care of things. All of the software's already, it comes with it, so you should be good to go on that.
Perfect. Hopefully that helped. I did have a follow-up from Roland saying, I mean, with the scanned photos, which show the creation date on which they scanned, but not when taken.
I believe your camera is still going to hold on to that when it was taken information most of the time. So I have to look at it to be sure, but that's usually embedded deeply into a photograph.
I think he's talking about analog photos that you've then scanned, right? Where the, like a print of a photo,
oh, right.
You're scanning, so it, right? I think that's the question.
I could maybe give an answer. I think a good way to, you could just incorporate that into the file name, and a good way to keep things in order is to go year, month, day, and then that will keep things by date.
Perfect. All right, another question for Helen. What is the name of the little black box storage device you were showing?
This is a WD Elements drive, and this one is just 1 terabyte. I have 4 more in my office up at campus, and those range from 6 terabytes to 28. So there's quite a range. I checked the prices on those really big ones. I was curious, and they were like between $300 and $800. And this one, I'm sure, is much more affordable.
Perfect. And then for those of us at home without an, oh, we just already did that one too. I apologize. What about cloth moths? Katie from Deborah.
Yeah, so those are a concern. Moths and carpet beetles are another one that you have to watch out for, that really like textiles, as well as silverfish. Silverfish are creepy looking too. I don't like silverfish. Silverfish are also something to watch for in your paper materials. But the thing with cloth moths that you don't want to do is mothballs. Those contain chemicals that can actually cause damage to the fabrics over a long period of time. And some of those the chemicals that they put in there are not great to be releasing some of those smells and stuff out into your own home. I keep a lot of my textiles. Cloth moths are particularly, they like protein fibers like wool and silk. So you can get like a small cedar ball, as long as it's something that is smooth on the surface and not going to snag on the fabric. Cedar is a really great thing to use. I store my wool knits in cedar chests. And one good thing to do periodically, like every couple years, is to get some pretty fine grained sandpaper, take everything out of the chest, sand it, vacuum it thoroughly, and then put it back in. It just kind of refreshes the cedar, and that can help take the bugs away. If you take something out, if you take a textile out of a place that you've had it stored, like say it's, it's been in the closet and you take out your sweater because it's cold out in October and a moth flies out of it, put that sweater in a bag and make sure it's all sealed up and stick it in your freezer. With your frozen veggies, it's fine. And you want to freeze it for about 72 hours. Take it out and leave it in the bag to cool down to room temperature. Then you can take it out of the bag and you can remove with like tweezers or something else, kind of small tool, any dead bug parts. Always a beautiful thing to be talking about cleaning your materials. So this is what we do. And then one of the links that I have in the resources in my handout goes to a document that talks very step by step about how to carefully vacuum your textiles using like a window screen and a low suction setting on a vacuum in order to vacuum up like smaller things that you can't pick up. So those are all ways to, if you find a moth or to prevent moths and other kinds of pests, to kind of keep them at bay and then take care of them if you do find them. I would say too that if you pull something out and it has a moth, check everything else around it. And if you're really concerned, then just put it all in the freezer so that you can just be reassured that you haven't missed like some eggs or something somewhere that are too small to see.
Perfect. And next, Katie, another textile question. Thoughts on the best way to store hand knit sweaters that are 80 to 90 years old from Amy?
Yeah, and so I just mentioned I store my sweaters in a cedar chest, mostly because they are made from wool. And I also store them folded carefully and flat. The biggest no-no with knits is to hang them, because knitting, the structure of a knitted fabric is very stretchy, which is why we like knits, because they're comfy, they kind of stretch around our bodies. But that means if you hang your knits, then you're stretching them out just from the weight of the gravity of the hanger. So you always want to fold your knits. That's true of your 80-year-old sweater or your 8-month-old sweater, to fold it on a shelf. And if it's something you don't wear a lot and you're really more interested in the preservation, to put it, on the shelf wrapped up also in like cotton sheeting or something like that to keep dust off of it.
Awesome. Okay, from Dennis to anyone, are there examples of file naming spreadsheets in the handout?
No, I don't think any of us put a suggestion. It's really dependent upon your needs and how you want to organize your materials. I don't know if
Helen
anybody
did put an
in the
example
library.
in the chat. Helen put an example in the chat. I will copy it and paste it in the chat as well, but here we are.
Okay.
From Ryan, best services for VHS and mini DV to DVD or USB?
I guess I'll take a crack at that. There are ways of doing this by yourself, but I really don't recommend it. There's a company here in town called AV Restore that will convert these for you professionally that we use at the libraries. And there are many others in Denver and Boulder. I know Walgreens and CVS also offer these services, but please make sure that you look at their specifications on what you're getting out in terms of a file content. You want to look at a movie file that's probably like an MPEG, which is a motion picture JPEG equivalent, or an AVI file, .avi, or something. You don't want to get a DVD back, because those are in a proprietary format that you can't export out and play without the DVD. So make sure that you get it in a usable format, that you get it back on a hard drive or a thumb drive.
Awesome. All right, to anyone, what is your favorite way to scan slides? From Jan.
I think scanning slides and negatives are a little harder to do at home because a regular scanner doesn't have the proper equipment attached to do that, because you need don't know the exact term, but there's a thing on the top that will scan it as you're scanning the bottom so you can see the light through it. So I would just recommend going somewhere else for those. If you're wanting to buy a scanner that actually will do that, the Epson Perfection was mentioned earlier, and that's what we use in the lab to scan negatives and slides.
Perfect. hopefully that answered the question. From Deb, she needs tips on how to remove photos from photo albums with sticky pages.
Yeah, we see this a lot. The best thing is probably just to leave them as is, or take it to a professional conservator for that. I've seen it's all too easy for any of us to just kind of rip it off and then damage the photo in the process. So I would recommend some professional treatment on those.
All right.
And I'd just like to add too that you could, if you're scanning your photos, just scan them inside the plastic sleeve.
Perfect. This one's kind of long, so bear with me. From Doreen, can the CSU Libraries Archives staff offer some recommendations for lay audiences on organizational conventions for physical manuscript / ephemera type collections? For instance, having multiple letters in separate sleeves, but how to treat organizing the envelopes and that sort of thing. Good guidebooks or websites for the generalists, etc.
I sure can. I can put some stuff in the chat. Generally though, what we do is to organize material by type. So if you have a group of letters, organize those into a group and then perhaps by dates along the way. And you can also have multiple items in a folder as long as they're not overstacked. So you don't have to do item by item organization. But yeah, organize it by correspondence or letters, by dates. You've got a group of scrapbooks or legal documents that you have. Just write those on the folder title right here, and you can have multiple items in a folder. You don't have any, for textual materials as well, we generally don't recommend putting stuff into sleeves of any kind outside of these acid-free folders and then within a box. But I can throw some stuff in the chat if that's helpful.
I think that would be great. Thanks, Mark. From Michelle, how is the best way to clean a textile before storing any certain product?
Do not get it wet is my first tip. Textiles are made from so many different types of materials, especially today, all of the different synthetics that are out there. And these different types of fibers react differently to water. And some of them, silk in particular, you're damaging the structure of the fiber itself by getting it wet. Like that can weaken the silk fiber very easily if you don't know how to do it properly. And so the biggest tip is to not get it wet and to do the process that I was just talking about, where you carefully vacuum it with using like a low suction clean vacuum and like a small attachment hose and a window screen. And so you just put the window screen between the textile and the vacuum, and that helps to make sure that you're not dragging the vacuum across the fabric very much. And so you also don't want to be like jabbing the vacuum into the fabric surface, because the goal is to keep the fibers intact. You're just trying to get any like surface dirt or something like that off of it. If it has a stain, it's very difficult to know what the stain was. A lot of the times you find something and you don't know, is it wine or blood or who knows? Like, and all of those stains can do different kinds of reactions to the fibers and have different reactions to different cleaning agents. If it's something where you really would like to have the stain removed, the best recommendation is to take it to a professional textile conservator. And they are very specially trained in testing and determining what those materials are and what the best option is. And sometimes they also may tell you it's probably better to leave the stain here because taking it out and cleaning the stain away can actually cause so much damage to the integrity of the fiber. So it's something that is hard to say. If it's something a lot of people want to clean, like their christening gown, which are typically made from cotton because cotton's yellow over time. That is something where you could, if you wanted to, gently soak it with just a little bit of Dawn dish soap, like very, very little, soap. You could even try just soaking it in plain kind of tepid water. You don't want to rub it or agitate it or wring it out. And you would want to lay it flat to dry in a place where it's not in the direct sunlight. So, don't throw it in the washing machine, self-agitating washing machine, and then hang it up on the line in the backyard, because you're going to cause a lot of friction and then a lot of light damage to something like that. So I hope that answered it a little bit. The answer is really kind of specific to each type of textile, and that's why the number one recommendation is to not clean it, like to not launder it as you regularly would.
Perfect. Another question for Katie from Ginger. What is the best way to preserve a Civil War era written document? Or I guess maybe it's not for Katie, but.
Well, I mean, I study that time period, but
right.
the old letters, I think that's one I'll leave that one to Mark. I can tell you about a Civil War dress.
Sorry, I saw Civil War, I apologize.
Yeah, again, I think the best thing you can do is probably get it in a stable environment, put it in a stable box of some kind, and get it out of sunlight, and avoid temperature and humidity fluctuations as well. And if you need support for it, these vendor supplies as well sell tissue paper that you can wrap the document or the item in as well to help preserve it and not be jostling around inside the box as well.
Perfect. From Miriam, she has a 100-plus-year-old Bible that is falling apart. Is there some place that she can take it to have it repaired? She also has old rolled up newspaper articles and doesn't know what's on it, but it's come down from the family. She's afraid to unroll it because it is so brittle. Is there some place to take it to have it opened and perhaps restored or preserved in some way?
There are professional conservators in the Denver area that can perhaps look at these two items. We don't have the services and taste and special skills to resew the binding of a book and or unroll an item like this that has been that old, because it can do it with humidity and humidification to put humidity back into the item to unfold it. But those are very costly and very expensive processes as well. So be prepared for that. And in some cases, leaving the items as is probably a good option as well.
Perfect. This is for Helen from Emily. Do you have any recommendations on where to store a huge number of digital photos without an extra hard drive? Is it best to keep them in a cloud/OneDrive or through a free location like Walgreens Photo Centers?
I'd probably stay away from Walgreens Photo Center, because my impression of companies like that is that to save costs over time, they're going to do things like reduce storage and get rid of older stuff. So I do think that an external drive would be the best thing. If you had an external drive, then you also had something like OneDrive or Google Drive. That would be a good pairing.
Perfect. For anyone, from Jan, does anyone have a favorite place to take slides or to have photos? Does anyone have a favorite place to take slides to have photos made?
Yeah, again, you can try the Walgreens or HVs of the world, but as caution, as Helen said, AV Restore here in Fort Collins will also do slides and other photographic materials as well.
Perfect. From Sharon, for old quilts that are missing a patch or have a torn patch, should we replace it with a similar fabric or just leave as is?
That's kind of up to you, and also kind of up to the overall kind of condition of the quilt and kind of where the patch is missing or torn. So if it's something that it's a quilt that you still use and you would like to keep using it, it may be better to replace it or repair it just to keep the quilt's life a little bit longer and just, for the aesthetic look of it. If it's something that is in like a storage state and you are thinking about maybe replacing that patch with a new patch or sewing up a tear, it's dependent too on your own sewing skills and whether or not you feel confident that you would like to undertake that. Or if you would like to kind of leave it as is to kind of maintain the integrity of whoever made the quilt. It really, there's no real yes or no answer to that question. If it's something that you do decide to patch it or tear or like repair a tear, that's where the kind of like spreadsheet documentation of the quilt, where you might say like, Grandma Sally made this and she made it around 1930, and then you could actually add a notation there where you might say, there was a tear in the lower left block, and then you might note like, I repaired this, or I added a patch. And then whoever inherits that quilt next now has the story of the history of you kind of adding to that family quilt by making that repair or replacement. And it just kind of adds another part to the story of the object. So it really is dependent on what you feel is best for your family's object and how you are using that object. And certainly, again, that is a situation where if you had something that had a lot of damage to it and you wanted to make sure that it was not going to continue to rip or tear or fall apart, that you might consider taking it to a professional conservator to have them stabilize it. They wouldn't be restoring it, so they're probably not going to replace it with a whole bunch of new patches, but they might help you get it into a situation where it's going to prevent further damage from occurring.
Perfect. From Victoria, if a textile hasn't been stored over the years in acid-free paper and or box, what type of damage might you see to the textile?
Yeah, that's always hard. Again, that can depend on the other conditions of the environment that it's been in. And so if it's been in a really dry place, or if it's been in a place where, if it's been up in the attic and the attic doesn't have, if your attic isn't hooked into like your home heating and cooling system, that can be an issue. In addition to storing it in something like a cardboard acidic box, that it can make the fabric brittle over time, where a lot of the time what we see is if it's something that's been folded, the crease of the fold, over time that fiber just breaks down and it can almost split, almost like it tears like paper. And there's really nothing that you can do to stop that from continuing to happen. One of the other big things that we see is people bring in their wedding dress that they had professionally dry cleaned, and they bought a very expensive dry cleaning service to clean their wedding dress, and it's been put into an acidic box with some sort of like, often they'll put like a cellophane window so you can kind of peer into the box and look and admire your dress, which sounds lovely. However, that can cause severe damage to your wedding dress. So you can't undo that, but you can remove it from that situation and make the situation better so that it can kind of try to stop further damage from occurring. And I'll just mention that what usually happens in those cases with those acidic boxes, and often with a white silk, usually dress, is what you're dealing with. It yellows the garment, and it turns into a really not very pretty color. So it's really unfortunate thing that happens. A lot of the archival supply companies now have kits you can purchase to properly store your wedding dress, or even like, your wedding suit. That's also important. You can also get that properly stored in a box in acid-free tissue, acid-free box.
Perfect. This is actually our last question that has been in the chat. So if you have more questions, please post them in there. It's from Lucy. Since hardware and software changes over time, can you reassure me that if I put things on a hard drive, that I could still access it in 10 or 20 years?
No, I cannot, and that's because formats have to be migrated. So I can't give you any reassurance or any happy thoughts about that. I would just keep up. Do not let things sit that long. If you come back 10 years later and you can't open something, What you probably should do is be checking on that content every year instead and see if it opens. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where you have to send out your content to a place like AV Restore, which makes a lot of money when people can't open their files. And they're professionals and they know how to get them open, but they are going to charge for that service. So just keep an eye on things. It's impossible to predict the future. We don't know what companies are going to do with their content and their formats in the future. There are some stable formats like the JPEGs and TIFFs have been around for a while, and I don't think they're going anywhere. And a CSV file and a text file, those should be openable for a long time. But everything else that's owned by Microsoft or Google, I'd be very careful about that stuff.
Perfect. Thank you. David did ask what the slide scanner's name was, and David, Trista did write you what it was, and I resent it to you, so you have that for your records. And then there are a few more questions that popped in. Is there a special technique for copying daguerreotypes, and is it safe to scan them? And I think she said tin type. Does that make sense? Tin type? Okay.
I can get some takes at first stab. Daguerreotypes are those early images that are bound in a case, and it's very important to leave those in the case because they've been without exposure to oxygen for such a long time that taking them out of case will cause further damage. And you can scan those things. It's however very tricky, and I will pass along to my colleague Trista, who has probably more experience in this than I have, but it can be done.
Yes, just very carefully. You don't touch the actual part of the image. Keep it to. I'll use my phone. Trying to hold things like this. Try not to handle it a lot. Just put it on the scanner, scan it, take it off. Just as little handling as possible is the best advice I can give.
Okay. This is the last question. So if there are more, please post it in either the chat or the Q&A, because we still have a little bit more time. The last one is from Sherry. She has a lot of hand crocheted pieces that are about 100 years old, and they've been professionally laundered previously, but now she can't find a source. Some are okay, but a couple others could use some professional attention. She used to use Colorado Lace, but that company is gone up as far as she knows. These include bedspreads and tablecloths. Any suggestions?
So what I'm hearing is that you've taken them to be laundered before, and I am not aware of anybody here really locally. There may be somebody down in Denver that does that kind of cleaning. You do want to be very careful about if you take it to somebody to make sure that if they're wet cleaning it, that they really know what they're doing and that they're not going to be using a bunch of harsh chemicals. With a lot of crocheted things, sometimes they want to starch those things, and the starches can be bad for the fabrics. So I'm sorry, I feel like I don't have a very good answer to this question because I'm not aware of a company locally right now that does that kind of cleaning. They kind of, we don't see them as much. Sometimes if you check out like people will call themselves like a green dry cleaner, sometimes they're using less harsh materials, but that doesn't always mean that they know how to handle those items, older items properly. Really, the best thing to do is to maybe contact a conservator, and if it's something that they feel like it's not to the extent of needing their attention, they may be able to direct you to a place that they trust as from their own professional background. To kind of help you make sure that if you do take it to a cleaner to be laundered, that it's going to be done respectfully of the age of those materials.
Perfect. We have two more questions that will probably hit us right on time. Sharon says her grandmother used to spray starch on some textiles. Should they be cleaned professionally or left as they are?
That's a good question, because to remove the starch, you're going to have to get them wet. if they're old linens, the starch over time, like if you got them folded, you would really want to be sure to pad out the folds. So it was like tissue, acid-free tissue, you can kind of create kind of a little roll of tissue you don't want to squish it all down really tight, keep it open a little bit, so that when along the fold of the fabric, there's a buffer kind of there, and that can help where the starch, because it makes the fabric stiffer, it can cause a lot more damage when it is folded. So that's something that I would do. And if they've been stored folded for a long time with the starch on them, you would want to be very, very careful when you are unfolding them, because you may unfold something and actually see a tear or cause a tear. And so you might want to kind of not unfold it completely flat to make sure that the fabric is still okay. As far as removing that starch, I would be very careful about doing that. And that is something where you might want to contact a conservator to just say, I have this stuff. Is this something you can help me with? And if there's damage that has been caused over time, then that especially might be something they could help you with to help stabilize those pieces.
Perfect. And I believe this will end up probably being our last question, but it is from Beth, asking, is there any specific recommendations for storing a World War II uniform?
Yeah, so that's probably made from wool. So you would want to kind of pay attention then to that fiber content. That's probably what it is, but I can't say for sure. You would want to, probably the best thing there, because those jackets in particular tend to get pretty heavy, is to try and store it flat, just because the weight over time of hanging it, it's going to be hard to find a strong enough hanger. If you do hang it, you want to put it on a padded hanger. And some of the resources that I shared in that document have instructions for making a padded hanger, where you basically put like polyfill batting inside of a muslin casing that you've made to cover a hanger. But for a uniform like that, you're going to have a pretty heavy duty hanger. Like pants, that might be part of that uniform. Again, you want to, if it's already something that it has like an ironed crease in it, which you see that a lot on uniform trousers, you don't want to pad that out too much, because that crease is already kind of there, and is purposefully there. So you just kind of want to make sure that you kind of layer some tissue, and if you have to fold any of the garments, that you pad out that fold with a roll of tissue. With the jacket, you would want to fold, try and lay it flat in the box so that it's not folded in half. You may have to set the sleeve kind of on top of the body of the jacket, and you would want to put tissue inside of the sleeves to kind of, as if there was an arm in the sleeve. Another thing you can do is make a casing out of a piece of like muslin or old sheeting and put batting inside of that. You would not want to put the polyfill batting immediately directly into the sleeve, but you could put some padding inside and make a casing, or just use that tissue. So any place that you feel like as it's sitting, because the garment is meant for a three-dimensional form, the body, that you see over time gravity might start to press down on it, you want to just kind of pad that out. And that's true for any type of garment that you decide to store flat. And even some garments, if you do decide to store them hanging on a hanger, you want to also cover them with a sheet or a piece of muslin over the garment on the hanger. You could also wrap the uniform and store it flat on a shelf inside of a sheet if you don't have an acid-free box. Just make sure that maybe you put a little, right on a piece of paper that doesn't have, not a Post-it, just a piece of paper, in pencil, like, Joe Smith's World War II uniform, and pin it to the outside of the sheet so that people know what's in there and that it's fragile and important. and put it on a shelf kind of up out of the way. So there's a lot of different options there. And I do know there are kits out there too that you can purchase from archival supply places too that are specifically geared toward all of the tissue and box supplies you would need for a uniform, because that kind of wedding dresses and uniforms are among the more common materials that people are looking to store.
Perfect. And that was all of our questions. We have about 3 minutes, so maybe for some final remarks from you all and Dakota.
I don't really have too much to add other than just thanking all of you for your time. It was really wonderful. We appreciate your partnership and taking your time out of your day to be with us today, and just thanking everyone who is here attending and who asked questions and engaged with us today. We really, really appreciate it. Anyone have anything else before we head out? Alrighty, well, all of you, like I said, will receive the recording next week. If you don't, for any reason, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.